even if the Bible was copied accurately through the years and we could trust the manuscript evidence that what we have today is what was originally written, how do we know that what's there, the content of the New Testament, is actually reliable? That's what we're going to talk about in just a moment. All right, I'm Steve Huff, and this is Reasons Matter, where we give you the evidence and answers to the Christian faith. And today we're going to talk about, can we trust the eyewitnesses who have recorded what is in the Bible? And this is important because even if we assume that the way the Bible's been transmitted down through the ages is accurate, and that we've translated it accurately, how do we know the content itself is reliable? Well, I want to share with you some of the information about why that is important. And I want to start out with the idea that the eyewitnesses really are the best sources. Okay? When you're having a court of law and you want to bring somebody up to testify about what happened, you don't bring people who were second and third and fourth hand types of things. You know, in some cases, you might bring up a secondhand account as long as there's somebody else there to verify it. I don't know all the rules of evidence, but let's cut to the chase. The bottom line is eyewitnesses and those who were there with eyewitnesses to record their story, that is the most reliable evidence. And especially if what they're testifying about or writing about are events that took place among many other eyewitnesses. And this is the case, by the way, with the New Testament. The New Testament was written by either eyewitnesses, for example, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John, written by eyewitnesses themselves, and then Mark and Luke were written by people who sat down with eyewitnesses, in this case, Peter and some others who were actual eyewitnesses, and gathered and recorded all that information. And then it was disseminated in the time period where there were lots and lots of other eyewitnesses that if the information recorded wasn't true, all of these people would have been able to say, hey, wait a minute, that's nonsense. That's not what happened. And there would have been big pushback. And those writings and those documents would have never gotten any real momentum. Well, there are so many scriptures that talk about how this was recorded by eyewitnesses, and I want to share some of these with you. All right, these are just a few. But here we are in Luke chapter 1. So Luke, before he begins to tell the story of the gospel, this is what he says. Let me take a drink. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who, from the first, were eyewitnesses. Do you see that? And servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Do you see that? This is a prime example of why eyewitness testimony is so important. In this case, it's Luke who has sat down with and he has recorded and compiled information from the original eyewitnesses, and he's sharing it with people who were also eyewitnesses so that they can have a written account, an orderly account of it. Now, let's go over to John chapter 19 in verse 34 and 35. This is where John is giving an account of Jesus' death on the cross. As you know, Jesus actually died while he was hanging there. Many times prisoners would be hanging, and it was such a slow, excruciating death that they would have to either break their legs or do something else in order to bring about death. But in this case, John's telling the story, and he says, so one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, that was significant, just as an aside, because what came out indicated that Jesus was already dead, and that's a lesson for another time. But verse 35, the man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may believe. You see that? Now, John would sometimes refer to himself in the third person that way. What he's really saying here is, look, I was there, I saw it, I know it's the truth, and I am testifying to you so that you may believe. Okay? Now, here's another one. This is towards the end of John's gospel. And John, as he's writing, says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so John's just making a little point here that, look, this is not an exhaustive account of everything Jesus said and did. He did many other things in the presence of his disciples, and I haven't recorded all of those. But look, I have written these things, which he did in our presence, so that you may believe. And that was the purpose of writing these things down. Now, right here at the very end of John's gospel in chapter 21, verse 24, he says, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. John is making a point that what he's writing down, what he's testifying about, are things that he knows is true. These are things he's personally seen. He's witnessed these things, and he's writing down some of the more important ones so that others can know and believe and be saved. And what's significant, once again, is that these things were written and circulated at a time when there were many, many other eyewitnesses who weren't necessarily writing them down, but were aware of what happened. You couldn't pass off false information in that scenario and have it get any real traction, right? There were too many eyewitnesses to refute what you were writing if you were just making things up. And that adds a lot of credibility to the writings of the Bible. So here's one in Acts chapter 10, verse 39. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a cross, of course, talking about Jesus. Verse 40, but God raised him from the dead on the third day and caused him to be seen. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. You get that? These are people who have given testimony because they were there. This is particularly important because this is the story of the death of Jesus and also him being raised from the dead. The resurrection, probably the single most important event in all of human history, is that Jesus died for our sins and then was able to overcome death and the consequence of sin and rise again, giving us hope for new life. And he's saying, now look, not everybody saw this, right? But there were a lot of us who were witnesses who did see it. And we didn't just see it. We spent time with him afterwards, right? We ate and we drank with him and so on. Here's another important example. In 1 Corinthians, where the Apostle Paul says, he's talking about how Jesus appeared to the 12, the apostles and others. And he says, after that, look at this, verse 6. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time. And this is important, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and then all the apostles. And Paul writes, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. And that's in reference to the unique encounter that Paul had with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. That could be the topic of another lesson. But you see this? He appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, and guess what? Most of them are still living. It's almost as if, as Paul's writing this, he says, if you have any doubt, let's just clear this up. It wasn't just me and a few people that Jesus appeared to in secret. He appeared to hundreds of people, and most of them are still living. Now, if you have any doubts, go check for yourself. Go round some of those people up, and they'll tell you exactly what they saw, and it's what I'm reporting. You see how significant that is? All right, I'm going to share just a couple of more examples with you. This is Peter writing in chapter 5. He's specifically turning his attention in this letter to the elders. He says, "To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's suffering, who will also share in the glory to be revealed." Peter, I think this is a part of his underscoring his authority to talk and give this direction to his fellow elders. And he's going, look, I'm not just a fellow elder. I was a witness of the things that happened. All right. This is getting old. Let me share this. 2 Peter. When Peter's writing in his second letter, he says, look, we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Right? He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." He's referring there, of course, to the beginning of Jesus' ministry when he himself was baptized and the clouds opened up and the voice from heaven said, as Peter quotes here, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." And then Peter goes on to say, "We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." So as you'll remember, Peter and a couple others were chosen to go up on the mountain with him where Jesus was transfigured into his glorious state and appeared there with a glorified Moses and Elijah, I believe it was. And so Peter witnessed that firsthand, not alone, but with some others, and heard the voice from heaven that came and affirmed the identity of Jesus. And so here's Peter's writing. We heard this for ourselves. All right, so I've no doubt beat this horse over and over again, ridden this horse into the ground, whatever metaphor you want to use. I'm just saying these are just some of the occasions where you're hearing these people say, we're not just making this stuff up, right? These are not cleverly invented stories, right? These aren't things that just happen off to the side. There are lots of eyewitnesses, and we were among them, and we're writing it down for you to believe. Well, they did not just appeal to fellow believers and this type of thing. They also appealed to, let's say, maybe opponents who were nonetheless also eyewitnesses. Let me just give you two examples of that. On the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, when people are gathered around and they're confused a little bit about what's happening, and people are making different charges of, improper charges about what's going on, and Peter steps up to preach. And he says in Acts 2:22, "Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know." Now then, Peter goes on to describe what happened and God's purpose in it, and how Jesus is the Savior who would bring forgiveness of sins to his people. But he starts out by saying that Jesus was accredited by miracles, wonders, and signs, and listen, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. When you can appeal to other eyewitnesses of events that have taken place, and you can say, look, what I'm about to tell you is true, and you know it, you yourselves know how Jesus was accredited to you by the things God did through him right in your presence. That is compelling testimony. And it should come as no surprise that at the end of this message that Peter gave, that over 3,000 received Christ and were baptized on that day. Eyewitness testimony shared to people who had seen the various events but maybe didn't understand them all. That's powerful. And one last one I want to share, because I didn't really want this to go quite this long, but this is the Apostle Paul when he's on trial in Rome. And again, this is Acts 26, verse 24. It says, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense and said, "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." So, as Paul's describing about Jesus and his death and resurrection, Festus thinks, man, this guy, Paul, is nuts. But Paul responds in verse 25, and he says, "I am not insane, most excellent Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him, because I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice." Look at this. "Because it was not done in a corner." Do you see that? Paul is making a defense here, and he's saying, look, I have no doubt even the king is familiar with all of these things. I'm convinced this has not escaped his notice. These aren't things that just happened in a quiet little corner somewhere. These were open and notorious events that took place. And this is sort of Paul's way of saying, look, I think virtually everybody knows about this stuff. Okay, eyewitness testimony is powerful. I want to just quickly share a couple other things about the eyewitnesses that I think will really help affirm for you that what we've got is reliable and trustworthy. The eyewitness accounts, somebody has described, I'm trying to remember who it was, I found this term, the AntiHero. What does the AntiHero mean? What it means is most people, if they're writing an account of events, and especially if they're kind of making it up a little or they're willing to embellish a little bit, most people are inclined to paint themselves in the most favorable light, right? Little mistakes or things or goof ups or other, things they did, embarrassing things, those tend to get left out when people are embellishing. But when people are committed to telling the truth, to being honest, forthright eyewitnesses, then they're going to tell it all. The things that make them look good and the things that, frankly, may be quite embarrassing to them. And so as you read the gospel accounts, you'll see that his closest disciples were often confused, and they had to pull Jesus aside and say, look, we don't get it. What exactly are you saying here? Explain this to me, please. And Jesus would go on to understand it. You've got the account of Peter denying Jesus 3 times after Jesus was arrested because of his fear. I probably, if I was telling a story and I was embellishing and I had done that, I'd probably leave it out, right? But if I'm trying to tell the truth because this is an important, critically important event in all of history, something special God is doing, I'm not going to leave out details, even if they're embarrassing to me. How about when the disciples were arguing among themselves over who would be the greatest in the kingdom, totally misunderstanding what the kingdom was all about? How about the night that Jesus would be betrayed and arrested, earlier that night when he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and he's in just anguish over all that is happening and what it's going to mean to face the cross, and he asks his closest friends, his disciples, to pray for him, and what do? They fall asleep, not once, but more than once. That's, it's kind of some of those embarrassing details. And then in the description of the resurrection, right, this cornerstone event that you might want to make sure you really sell this strongly, even if it's true, right? I want to sell this so people get it. I'm not going to leave any room, right? And yet, what do you read? You read about these disciples having doubts initially about the reports of the resurrection. I could go on. There are lots of more cases. Later in the ministry, as they're going about establishing churches and leading people to Christ, Paul and Peter end up butting heads because Peter is goofing up, and I'll just say, I don't want to get into the whole story, but goofing up in what he's saying. Paul says, I had to confront him to his face. Paul and Barnabas got in an argument one time about whether to take John Mark on the next missionary journey because Mark had sort of bailed on them the first time. Very, very human things that are not left out because this was critically important and they were committed to telling the truth. The last thing I want to share, and then we'll wrap this up, is that These eyewitnesses were putting it all on the line. What do I mean by that? You know, it's one thing if you want to make up a story, right? Spread a bunch of stories, try to get something going grandiose that's not true. If you have something to gain from it, right? But you ask yourself the question, what did these guys have to gain? What did the 12 have to gain? What did Paul have to gain by not only spreading the word and testifying about Jesus and what he had done in his death and his resurrection? What did they have to gain by that? Well, first of all, we'll say they were putting everything on the line because these guys, let me share a quote from J.P. Moreland. These guys they had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. So if what they were writing was just a spurious religious document trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, everything to lose, nothing to gain. It says this, J.P. Moreland, "It seems clear that the New Testament writers were able and willing to tell the truth. They had very little to gain and much to lose for their efforts. For one thing, they were mostly Jewish theists. To change the religion of Israel with its observances of the Mosaic law, Sabbath keeping, sacrifices, and clear-cut non-Trinitarian monotheism would be to risk the damnation of their souls to hell." Right? Now, if you're an atheist or you're uncertain about your faith, that may not mean a lot, but to members of the early church, these Jewish men who had given their lives to Christ, that meant everything. They were literally putting their eternity on the line. If they were wrong or just making this up, they were turning their back on everything they had known to be true. But they were convinced that Jesus was the fulfillment of the promises God had made to Abraham, that through the nation of Israel and its sacrificial system and all of that was just preparing the way for Jesus, who would be the great sacrifice, who would die on the cross, would rise again to give us the hope of rising to new life. And they put their eternities on the line. And you can say, well, that's kind of grandiose and everything, but really, I mean, who knows what they really were believed? They could have just still, maybe they're making this up. Let me point out one other way that they were putting it all on the line. Every single one of them died a martyr's death. Peter was crucified upside down. Tradition tells us he was crucified upside down rather than recant his faith. They were jailed, they were beaten, they were imprisoned, and ultimately were put to death. And not a single one of them ever went back on the claims of what they had witnessed and experienced. Not a single one recanted their faith. And so I hope you understand that the basis for our faith is not a blind faith. It's not something where you just, close your eyes and take a blind leap and hope it's true and we'll find out in the end. We can have great confidence that the Bible is true, and in part we can have that confidence because of the power of the testimony of these eyewitnesses. I want to thank all of you for watching today, and be on the lookout for some more lessons. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't. Give us some comments, and I'll be sure to respond to those. If you've got questions or want to share your thoughts, love to hear from you. In the meantime, I just want to thank you again for watching, and we'll close out with this.